Hello and welcome to the CX Files for June 13th, 2024. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in London, England.
And I'm Peter Ryan, joining you today, Mark, from New York City, where I'm attending Nearshore Nexus that is being put on by our good friend Kirk Laughlin from Nearshore Americas.
That's great. We're both on the road this week, all at the same time.
Exactly, we're nylons, me in New York, you in London.
Absolutely. Well, we've got an interesting chat this week because a friend of ours and a visitor to the pod in the past, Stephen Loynd, the founder of TrendzOwl, has a new book out. Now, this literally just came out at the start of the week. So this pod is probably the first mention of it anywhere, I would imagine, unless Steve has been firing out press releases early this week. But it's called The Widening Turn, America and the Accelerating Sweep of Innovation. And it's really a sort of detailed exploration of what's going on in American innovation at the moment. Really, we're sort of looking at how AI is changing the workplace. And what Steve does that I think is interesting is instead of the typical kind of froth that we've seen in the media about stuff like AI, he's kind of looked back at history. He's looked at the first circumnavigation of the Earth, the introduction of electric grids, things like this to say how these kind of discoveries or big changes then changed and shaped other industries. So he's kind of talking about AI now as if we're in the foothills of discovery, and there's a lot more to come.
Yeah, and you're not going to get a better person than Steve Loynd to be able to provide such an assessment. I've known Steve for well over 20 years now, and he's one of the most thoughtful people that you will come across in our industry, certainly from the standpoint as somebody who works as an advisor or as an analyst in a very, I would say, objective fashion. And Steve has got, I think, the unique talent of being able to make these allusions and find historical precedents to demonstrate how history does repeat itself and how there are similarities between things such as what happened in terms of the original exploration back 500-600 years ago versus what's going on today. So I have no doubt that the readers of this book, of Steve's latest book, are going to be very impressed. And I mean, as you say, Mark, this is literally hot off the presses.
Oh yeah, it is literally just out this week, and I know that he's been working on this for a long time because he was talking to me about the process of getting it out there and how he should promote it and that kind of thing. And we're happy to be sort of helping him along the way with the
Yeah.
first mention.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as I mentioned, Steve is probably one of the best people we know in the industry. You mentioned that he's been a frequent guest on the podcast. And I think it's because he comes to the table with unique ideas. He comes to the table not afraid to break a few eggs to make the omelet, to use a cliche. But the fact is, too, Steve doesn't necessarily follow conventional wisdom. He certainly, I think, has his own unique set of views that are very important and very refreshing in a space that, Mark, I think you can certainly agree with me that as we've been in this industry as long as Steve has, it's unfortunately falls victim so often to groupthink. Steve's not afraid to call out conventional wisdom or so-called conventional wisdom and to really call a spade a spade.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's interesting here is that although his book is really focused on innovation and the kind of innovation that we can expect to see from the new wave of AI, he does use customer experience extensively as an example. And I think that's because, and he details in the book that it's often the kind of test bed. It's where companies want to try things first. Is that sort
Yep.
of interface between the brand and the customer? That's where
Yep.
they're prepared to do some experiments with AI, with chatbots, with new ideas. And you certainly won't see most of the initial innovation in the back office. So the kind of area that we talk about on this podcast is actually very much crossing over with what Steve's talking about here.
Well, I think you've laid out a very nice framework in terms of what you're going to be discussing with Steve in your chat, and certainly what the listeners of the podcast can anticipate when they pick the book up. So, why don't we go over directly to the interview that you did with Stephen Loynd from TrendzOwl and find out more?
Hi, Steve. It's great to get you back on CX Files. Now, the listeners to this show know you as an analyst at TrendzOwl in Virginia, and you've got a focus on technology innovation and CX. Now, you've just published a new book titled Widening Turn, which is an exploration of ideas around innovation in the US. So how would you describe the book? What's your sort of elevator pitch, and why did you actually sit down and write this?
Yeah, thanks for having me first, Mark. Really appreciate it. And the genesis of the book was actually happy hour in DC. I was summoned by some friends, and so of course I gathered my energy and I hopped on the metro, which I love to take because it's so convenient. Of course, the traffic's terrible in DC, but I live in Northern Virginia, so I go right across the Potomac. But I had just finished this fascinating book by William Manchester called A World Lit Only by Fire. And it's all about the transition from the Renaissance, Middle Ages to the Renaissance. And I had this book on my mind as literally I just finished it and I get on the metro and crossing over and I'm looking out at the some of the little boats going down the river, and I'm thinking about the age of discovery that I had read about. There's a great quote toward the end of the book that had made me really stop and put the book down, to the effect of um, speaking about Magellan, Ferdinand Magellan, and his five ships that circumnavigated the globe. When they returned, Manchester says something to the effect of they had proven that the world is a sphere, but they were not yet thinking spherically, meaning the medieval mind needed time to absorb this reality about the shape of the earth. So I'm thinking about this like, wow, this is very similar to the time we're living in because of all the new technologies that are coming along that we're discovering and have been discovered, but we don't know what the implications are and what they mean yet. Anyway, quick end of the story. In a remarkable moment of synchronicity, I came to the metro stop on the Blue Line, Archives Navy Memorial, and I'm walking out. I'd never seen this before. I don't go to this stop a lot, and this thing on the wall caught my eye, and I walked over, and it's in gold in the curvilinear wall, and it's a poem by Fernando Pessoa, the Portuguese poet. And I read the poem. I had to read it a couple of times, but I realized, oh my God, this is about the age of discovery, what I was just thinking about. And there's an image of pulling back the veil on how the Western world is now changing the way that the world will function. In essence, it will lead to centuries of Western domination and how everybody looks at things. And so I have all this on my mind. And then, of course, I go to happy hour and I have a couple of Flying Dog IPAs. And I'm like, I have to write a book. And in a nod to yourself, you've published so many books. You have been telling me for a couple of years now, hey, man, you should write a book on Amazon. And so this was the genesis, the dawn of my idea about innovation. And, you and I were chatting earlier about we're in this customer contact ecosystem. And what is so fascinating, and I think I brought this up at the happy hour, is we're actually at the tip of the spear. The contact center is the use case, I would argue, for everything that the entire society now is reading about what OpenAI, Anthropic, Microsoft, you name it, Google, they're chasing improved conversational AI systems. They're chasing ultimately AGI or these types of things. And what space, if not the contact center, is the great proving ground. So here we are, all of a sudden, decades of people saying that, oh yes, things never change in the contact center space. And now we're at the vanguard of change because of all the innovation. So that's a long answer to the dawn of me deciding to sit down and finally trying to write a book.
Okay, and you mentioned early on in the book that you live very close to the new Amazon headquarter too in Virginia, which I mean, I guess over the past few years, as it's been constructed, it's a very visual sort of metaphor for change in the area. I know you've seen like shopping malls just being completely changed or closed, um, and Jeff Bezos actually said something that today is another golden age of innovation. And you talk about that a little bit in one of the early chapters. And I was thinking, that kind of plays off what you were just saying. I mean, do you think that we really are in a new wave that might be as significant as these, the Renaissance that you mentioned before?
We are in a new age of discovery. And so to kind of answer your question and continue the prior thought, I formed the overarching metaphor of my book, if you will, is that my insistence that America today, if you live here and I'm in the nation's capital, we're like a modern American Magellan. We are like Ferdinand Magellan. We are driven, possessed with this compulsion to innovate. In his case, it was to sail to the Spice Islands, and he had to raise money and convince people to be able to do it. And in our case, it's this compulsion, most immediately in the realm of AI and technology. And so that is kind of the overarching idea of my book, a new age of discovery that we're in. And indeed, like you say, Bezos made mention of this years ago. I think it was 2017 when he used the metaphor, but I was up on the 18th floor of my gym, and this is in my prologue. And I'm on the elliptical machine, and that's when you get your idea, so many great ideas. And I'm looking out at the Pentagon. This was just after the Ukraine disaster started, the invasion of Ukraine. And a general I talked about this at Glasgow at CXO. And he went a four-star general in America on CNN, and he shared this video clip, and he claimed that it was a missile shooting down a Russian aircraft. And he said, "This is great. Ukraine's winning. We're shooting down all the Russians." And it turned out he had shared a video from Arma 3. And I was on the elliptical thinking about this, like this guy who has more experience than anybody in war doesn't know what he's talking about, because technology is now, we are so disoriented as a society. He's a fine example of that. And I'm looking at the Pentagon thinking about it. And then next door in the foreground is the new Amazon HQ2 that's just risen up. And I thought of that quote from Bezos about how technology, and I think he was alluding to AI, but maybe not necessarily specifically that, but it's all part of the same idea that we're in this new age of discovery, a new renaissance, if you will. And a byproduct of that is that whether it's an American general or any citizen, there are moments where you feel like we really don't know what's going on. Back to the quote I open the book with from William Manchester. We're in this period between discovery and understanding, and we're trying to figure it out because technology is racing ahead so quickly.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that something that's interesting is how you look back to Magellan circumnavigating the globe. You're quoting Seneca, you're quoting Pessoa. You're looking at a lot of classical literature as well as contemporary sort of business literature. You've got McKinsey and KPMG and business stats in there as well. Do you think that we often in the business area, business and CX kind of area, where we often just quote these business white papers and reports, we actually miss out on a lot of ideas, and especially around innovation, perhaps from literature itself, or there's other sources of ideas that are not necessarily coming from business consultants.
Yeah, no, I mean, I love that idea. Like so many happy hours, how many times somebody says something out of the blue and you look at him or her and you're like, wow, that was really powerful, and has nothing to do directly with the topic at hand, but they come at it elliptically. And those are the Emerson, one of my favorite writers. You and I have talked about him a lot because he's from Concord, Massachusetts, my hometown, born and raised. He had a phrase. He said, "I read for the flourishes." That's a very Joycean thing to say. We're both James Joyce fanatics. He talked about epiphanies, whether it's in life or in reading or in conversation, when there's just a little image or something that comes across, and it changes the way you think about something. And I feel like it makes a lot of sense to introduce other realms into discussions because it offers a new way of thinking about things. And when you meet people that can do that, whether it's in a boardroom or at a happy hour, it just elevates everything, and it feeds ideas and enthusiasm in my mind.
Yeah, and I think that you talked a lot about scale as well, like the vast scale of government budgets and even vast companies like Amazon, for example, and how having that kind of scale enables you to try ideas. And obviously, if you're trying lots of new stuff, you're going to fail sometimes, but that's the driver of innovation. If you look at Amazon, if you Google Amazon failures, there's loads of failed brands, but they kind of just know how to try stuff and get rid of it if it's not working. I mean, are we kind of ignoring the opportunity within larger sort of institutions like government then? Because if we look back in history, you've got things like ARPANET, like the modern day internet was actually created by the Department of Defense. And I guess nowadays we just kind of think of the government as bureaucracy and not innovative at all.
Yeah, no, awesome question. And in fact, chapter one of my book, and the book is kind of shaped, I'm riding around on the metro thinking about these things. And I actually start off wondering if the defense industry in the United States, because if you get on the metro in DC, it's like you see all these defense contractor ads and it's all AI now. And it's like, how much is American innovation being in effect militarized? And what I mean by that is, to your point, I mean, the internet was born out of a lot of the digital revolution of what DARPA, or the defense agency that I forget the full agency name, but the research the scientists were doing ended up bleeding over, if you will, forgive the pun, into the consumer economy. And that it occurred to me in the first chapter, there's this new movement of a field afoot in the US in the VC community, American dynamism. And huge amounts of money are being raised in Silicon Valley to offer solutions to the defense industry. So you have this dynamic now where, because of the second half of my book is about China and how the idea of China and even the fear of China is propelling the compulsion to innovate even more due to competition. And so our defense community is now investing even more in trying to come up with, in the realm of AI specifically, to get to super intelligence, as an example. And they're co-opting, in a sense, I get the feeling, much of Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley, in turn, is now raising money straight out to say, hey, we can offer solutions to the defense community. And the point in talking about this is that to your point, Mark, it's the effects on the consumer economy. It seems to me by the end of this decade, we're going to start to see things we hadn't expected because of this dynamic. And the Chinese are doing the same thing. Another point that you made is, the process of trying and failing. In China, I talk about, if you think the competition for AI, to innovate AI in the US is intense, they call it the war of 100 models in China. I just read about a company called Moonshot AI in China that got all sorts of new funding from, I think, Tencent and maybe Alibaba, something like this. But they're racing to innovate. And the China playbook, if you will, is massive investments. A lot of it's state subsidized early on, and there's a lot of failure. But those that emerge victorious end up dominating, for example, the solar industry, like China is. And today it's about EV and batteries. If you read about the China playbook, that they're not, it's changing the world. How do we react to it? And then you start to think about, well, what about their research in AI and AGI? What possibilities are there? So your question was about scale, but whether it be Amazon or Tencent and Alibaba. It's these giant cloud capacity to scale that's feeding a lot of this AI innovation across the world.
Yeah, and I thought that there was an interesting and important point about the human element as well, in that companies can be extremely innovative and can try loads of new ideas. Meta with their push on the metaverse being a good example. But you know, if the end consumers just don't really want to use it, then even a great idea isn't going to work. And you talk a lot in the book about like what's coming after the smartphone, because we've all been carrying phones for the last 30 years, and you know, for almost the past 20 years they've become smarter and smarter until now. You know, I mean, I rarely make a phone call on my phone. It's you know, it's a communication device, but it's also a Kindle and audiobooks. You know, it's so many different devices all in one. um, so I mean, how do you push consumers in a certain direction as well? Because the companies are trying to innovate and look at maybe wearable devices and stuff like that. But is there any way of changing consumer opinion, or you know, or is that just the fact that humans are always going to be there in the loop?
No, it's a great question about, you know, in the background, this whole question about the quote metaverse. And um, because this just occurred to me, we're just talking about the defense industry. You know, I forget who said it, but something to the effect of, you know, you're not interested in war, but war is interested in you. Probably an ancient philosopher, you know, and we see that playing out today in many ways. But it's like, I also now I think about Paul Krugman, the Nobel-winning economist in the United States. Famously, I think it was in the early 2000s, he said that the internet, at the end of the day, it wasn't going to amount to that much. Something equivalent to the fax machine was his quote, something to that effect. So there's an example of somebody who wasn't interested in it and didn't understand that what was happening and what was about to happen. And he's a much smarter than I am and most people. Um, it's the consumer might not be interested in the metaverse or spatial computing today, but it's my conviction. I talk about the kind of sailing into a 3D world over time, that it will be interested in us. In other words, we're being immersed in it over time. One example would be, forget about the consumer for a second. Last June, I think it was, Nokia and EY um, showed results of a study that the enterprise or industrial metaverse had been exceeding expectations for a number of firms according to their survey. And I forget the exact numbers, but for example, in retail, there's all sorts of entities that are using digital twins to improve the layout of stores and, in effect, improve the customer experience. So the digital twin or the industrial metaverse or the enterprise metaverse is being used in real time. It's already succeeding, but we're not really aware of it on the consumer side as much because the story is one of failure. And there's also this idea that Tim Sweeney talks about this, Epic Games CEO, that people kind of misunderstood Zuckerberg when he renamed his company and he talked about the metaverse, but he never meant to mean that it would be there in a year. He himself articulated all the investment and all the hard work and challenges that it would face to create this thing. And I wrote a blog kind of comparing it to the creation of Stonehenge. I mean, you've got to drag all these resources. It takes time and resources to create. And I think that's what the metaverse or spatial reality immersive experiences really is. It's more of a process to best understand what's happening for the skeptics that are out there. But back to that, we're in this period of discovery and understanding. Everybody's trying to get their sea legs to understand it. And at the same time, the skeptics are their case is well made. One thing I do in the book later on in the book is not only is innovation important, but so too is persistence. The CEO of NVIDIA, Jensen Huang, gave a famous interview where he talked about if entrepreneurs knew how hard it would be, they'd never stop. And in his long explanation, he said, or never start. He said he never would have done this. if he knew how hard it was going to be. And he actually references Omniverse, which is NVIDIA's metaverse specific offering, how hard it is to try to get it to the next phase. And so I just see a bit more of a process, and it's part of the story that we're all kind of trapped in, if you will, at this point in time, which is an incredible point in time.
Yeah, and even if there's less consumer understanding, do you think that we've seen a maturity in the media coverage? Because you mentioned some numbers saying that like over 80% of companies will be using Gen AI by within about a year, by 2026, I think. And that seems to be more of an acceptance that this is a tool that companies can use to maybe increase productivity or efficiency, rather than the kind of business coverage we had in 2023 was apocalyptic. I mean, I remember the Washington Post, the Guardian, all of these major titles saying professional jobs are finished.
Well, it's a great question. I would point listeners to today, in fact, in the New York Times. I think his name's Tom Edsall, writes a piece about the different studies that have come out over the last 2 years. He references the famous Brynjolfsson, and I forget the other two researchers, or two or three researchers, talking about the increases in productivity that could result, and that back to this idea of being, it can help people, and it'll help economic growth, because the process, although it looks small, growth in 1 year, over time it compounds. And so you get back to this idea of exponential improvement and growth in economies. But he also talks about another study, Simon Johnson, I think, is and another couple of guys that are much more of the view that right now, there's all of this stuff, there are going to be job losses, and the government, they're inferring, needs to step in. So that argument's still taking place. I think that there is, to your point, right now, I think there's a view gaining a little bit of a hold on the ladder of ideas that it's possible that these AI solutions, OpenAI and others across the board, are being reaching toward commodification, and that things like cost are becoming a real barrier for some firms, and not to mention the cost of resources and electricity and environment. And so, and of course, Gary Marcus is one guy that talks about he doesn't see a big jump to the next ChatGPT 5. He thinks it's going to plateau out, and OpenAI is like almost like the dot-com boom and all that stuff. So companies, they don't know. I mean, it's so different. There's so many different experts with different ideas, and even the smartest people don't know. From Geoffrey Hinton will disagree with Jan LeCun. They'll have kind of an ongoing debate about the nature of AI and where it's headed. And that's what's so cool to me, is that you sit back and you say, wow, if these guys don't know, then how does anybody else know? I just realized I watched I encourage you to check out the new Lex Fridman podcast. He had this computer scientist on by the name of Roman Yampolsky, I think is his name. And just last night I watched it. It's like 2.5 hours. And he is of the extreme opinion, and what a bright guy when you listen to him, that there is no way we can make this process safe. And he explains to Lex Fridman, who of course is the ultimate optimist, he explains to him why this kind of self-learning, self-replicating process that is already underway will inevitably lead to a loss of control. And Lex pushes back a little bit, but listen to that conversation. So imagine what firms are thinking about. Think about the contact center and the customer contact ecosystem, all the confusing things that they have to try to wrestle with. And that's part of the reason I wrote the book. There are big ideas involved here, and not just on the ground operational issues. It's a really unique time where we need to think about it in both senses.
Yeah, one of the kind of evolutionary changes that you talked about in the book regarding the customer experience is all of our digital assistants actually becoming quite useful, and having access to our diary, having access to our personal details. Because at the moment, stuff like Siri, it's good for finding a gas station. Alexa can turn on your music, all this kind of stuff, but they're not really useful if you're trying to make a complaint about a hotel or try to find the cheapest flight to Paris. Whereas
Good afternoon, Mark.
now
I don't know that one.
So now my Alexa is actually talking to me because I mentioned it.
Unplanned. That was perfect.
But I suppose the point that you're making is that these tools are evolving, and will actually be much more like the kind of open AI model, will be conversational. I will be able to outsource my problem finding a flight to my assistant and just leave it to get on with it. And it will then be probably engaging with a digital assistant at the airline or at an airline brokerage or something. So this is completely upending the whole customer service model, isn't it?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, it's the combinatorial explosion of possible idea pairings that is kind of at the root of innovation and technology itself. I mean, you think about combining personal assistants with chatbots and what the potential, to your point, is. Where can this go and where will it end? And we just don't know. There's an amazing article in the New Yorker talking about the aforementioned sort of debate between Jan LeCun and Jeffrey Hinton. And I forget the writer's name, but it's amazing. He cites Jan LeCun and says we don't need to worry about AI trying to take over or becoming too powerful because it doesn't have that urge to dominate. That's called testosterone. And then Jeffrey Hinton's like, well, that's a comforting thought, but it's not necessarily the case. And then the writer, as he's thinking about this, he looks around Jeffrey Hinton's cottage and he sees these spider webs. And he thinks to himself, AI is like it's insectoidal intelligence almost. In other words, insects don't have an idea or an urge to dominate. There's no central brain. And yet these spiders the web that they're building is spreading. It's this combinatorial, powerful thing across the entire cottage. What's driving that? It's like ants that they eat food, they cross rivers, they obliterate competitors as a swarm. But what is the force that's driving that? And nobody really knows. It's not testosterone. It's not a will to dominate. It's just some inexplicable force. And this reminds me, when I was reading that, I thought of, back to your question about thinking about things from the perspective of other realms. I also talk about the American poet Robert Lowell in my book. And this quote, he has this amazing poem, Autumn 1961, and he's sitting in his office in Back Bay, Boston, on Marlborough Street. And this is during the Cuban Missile Crisis and the threat of nuclear war, which kind of sounds familiar today. But in the poem, there's a line to the effect of, there are a lot of wild spiders crying, but without tears. And it's such a weird line. I don't even know what it means, but I thought of that line when I read about the spider webs in Jeffrey Hinton's apartment, in his cottage. And it's like, well, the wild spiders, of course, it's like, what a prophetic voice Robert Lowell was about. This is AI, like a lot of wild spiders crying, but without tears. It's like, we can't hear them, but it's our whole society now, ever since the release of ChatGPT, has been subsumed, the media and the culture, in the pursuit of AI, and we don't even know what it is, but we can't literally hear them, but we can hear them spreading and crying and doing their work. And there's kind of an insidious side to it, maybe too, that, back to Roman Yampolsky's point on Friedman last night or whenever it was taped, we don't really know. It's back to this idea of discovery. We're in this period between discovery and understanding. And the hope is that the great optimists and innovators, entrepreneurs, in tandem with smart governance, we really are in a new renaissance. And for the customer contact space, that it'll lead to a world of massive interconnection with even more commerce and maybe even more agents. We don't know. And so there's so many ideas to think about on this topic, which is wild. Um, who would think that the customer contact ecosystem would offer us so many avenues to investigate, to talk about, so many happy hours, to get another IPA and think about what's happening? This is the great use case. What other industry is there that look at LinkedIn? We're out on LinkedIn all the time, guys like us, and I'm sure you have friends and colleagues. They don't even go on LinkedIn, but maybe it's because their industries are not so directly involved. You and I feel compelled. We have to be part of this conversation. And so in that sense, I think we're fortunate and really lucky to be part of whatever it is that's happening. It's really cool, really exciting.
Yeah, it feels a bit like I was thinking about it as electrification, where towns that installed local electric grids were mainly focused on introducing electric lights into homes, getting rid of gas lights and this kind of thing. And that was the initial focus. But you imagine now we couldn't live our lives without homes that have electricity, and it's no longer just about light. There's now so much more. And I was also thinking that kind of runs parallel with the launch of the iPhone and how Steve Jobs wanted to control what was on the iPhone. But within about a year, he was convinced that actually being able to customize it would create a better user experience. But it's actually done so much more. Introducing that idea of the App Store and being able to customize your phone. I mean, it's created entire industries. That now, if I want to, I don't know, if I want to start my own digital bank, actually all I need to do is create an app and launch it, and it can go global if I want it to. So that there's a sort of incredible exponential effect to some of these changes.
Well, yeah, the widening turn is an exponential curve. It has many meanings. The widening curve, you're taking that curve and you're getting more and more opportunity the wider it goes. There's also the implicit danger that you might hydroplane if you're going too fast and it's raining. But the exponential curve is a similar idea. And to your point, like these guys, whether it's Steve Jobs or Jeffrey Hinton, some of the smartest people, they often don't know themselves what's going to happen. The amazing quote we've talked about before by Sundar Pichai, when he said in 2018 that AI, to speak to this idea of electricity, he said, AI it's going to be more important than electricity or even fire. And this blew me away. I built presentations around this quote, 2018. And yet, think about this. I think I mentioned this before. 5 years later, even he isn't ready when ChatGPT is released to the wild, into the world. He calls it code red for Google. Even this guy who is at the top of his space, one of the smartest people, even his nonlinear thinking, he wasn't thinking exponentially enough. He wasn't thinking spherically, like, back to a world lit only by fire. That's the time we're in. The speed of change is upending everything. And so every company has to have an innovation agenda. That's kind of the ultimate conclusion of my book. And I have some key takeaways at the end about the customer contact ecosystem and what it needs to be thinking about as technology races forward. Because again, the general on the ship of the USS America he's trying to get his sea legs, just like I was on the elliptical machine. He's using a video game and he doesn't even know it from Arma 3. I mean, there's so much happening in this interregnum. It's a murky, foggy interregnum between discovery and understanding. There's a Gramsci quote that it kind of goes on the dark side of it. But, this is what we're living in. It's unbelievable times.
Yeah, and your book often references the metro. You're often thinking as you're traveling to a happy hour or some other event, and it just seems that we actually do need to stop and think a lot more about how our business is organized and what's going to happen next year. Because most of the time, most of us are just running from one meeting to another. and not actually thinking, where's my industry going to be in 3 or 5 years from now? And yet the change that's taking place is so fast. So how do you suggest? I mean, what are some of the takeaways or suggestions then for how do we make any kind of prediction about where the pieces are going to fall?
Yeah, it's such a great point. I mean, and you know this better than I do because you've written so many books. I finally decided after I had my epiphany on the metro, thinking about the age of discovery, and we're in a new one, and Ferdinand Magellan, and we're this big American Magellan, my country that has so many. It's a brilliant, manic, crazy place, I finally decided how am I going to think about this? I kind of disappeared a little bit from LinkedIn because for me, writing is thinking. And so that I started to work through this book and I kind of lost myself in thinking. It's kind of a mad jumble of ideas because, as I said, the second half of the book, I talk a lot about China and the new digital Silk Road and why that's relevant to what's happening. And the only advice I can give is maybe that process of stepping away and just really trying to think about things because we're all caught up in the day-to-day and the brush fires. And the great thing about what you and I do is we run our own shops, so maybe we have an opportunity to step away once in a while and think about things. But if you're running an enterprise or a BPO or a systems company, the more meetings you can have with smart people and the more brainstorming you can do you're probably going to be better off because we have to be open to the possibility of anything today that's happening. And that's the best advice I can give is step away to try to process things. I mean, my book, in a lot of ways, it's like I feel like I have to write another book because everything's happening so fast. There's a couple of instances in the book that I now need to be updated, and it's just coming out. That's how fast things are moving. So more conversations with people, more happy hours, a couple of IPAs, and you're off to the races, it seems to me.
All right, that's great advice, definitely, especially having a couple of IPAs and thinking about it. Well, it's the Widening Turn, and Stephen Loynd, the author. Anyone searching for your name or the book name on Amazon, I guess, is going to find you now. So thank you very much for letting us know about the book.
Thanks so much for the platform, Mark, and I appreciate the opportunity and continuing to discuss things offline as we do, and I'll see you soon, I hope.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.